You know, when we think about massive historical empires, we almost always picture the same things, right? Conquering armies, marching in, violently redrawn borders, a king planting a flag in the ground. But what if I told you that one of the absolute most powerful empires in all of European history completely transformed a region without ever actually taking it over? Today, in this explainer, we're unpacking the invisible empire of the Venetian Republic and its incredibly deep, lasting grip on southern Italy. It's a fascinating story about the nature of power and money, and it's going to force you to rethink how influence actually works.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp this unique dynamic, we have to tackle a major historical misconception right out of the gate. Did Venice actually conquer southern Italy? I mean, given their massive, legendary maritime power, it's super tempting to assume they just sailed their fleets down the Adriatic Sea and took over the coastline. But historically speaking, that never happened. The region we're talking about remained firmly, undeniably under the political control of the Kingdom of Naples and its various royal dynasties. So if Venice wasn't actually in charge, what on earth were they doing there?
Well, answering that requires a complete paradigm shift. We have to look at Venice as an empire that shaped the land entirely without ruling it. Instead of picturing an invading army marching in and setting up a local government, think of Venice as this invisible gravitational force. They were an external economic pressure cooker that ended up dictating the rhythm of everyday life, the flow of goods, and even the movement of people in the Terra di Bari region, and they did all of this from the water. They honestly didn't need to own the land, not when they had total control over the sea that the land completely depended on. Picture this. You've got two completely different spheres of influence operating in the exact same place at the exact same time. On the land, you had this heavy, direct political domination coming from the Kingdom of Naples, where local feudal lords were actively subjugating the peasant population. But out on the water, you had an economic sphere dominated top to bottom by the Venetian Republic. Venice didn't bother sending tax collectors to local peasants. Instead, they built this massive, unavoidable trade dependency. It was just a brilliant strategy of indirect influence, and honestly, it was arguably just as powerful as the kings who actually lived in the local castles. And you know, this didn't just happen overnight. This was a slow burn. If we look back to the 11th century, Venetian merchants started arriving in ports like Bari and Trani, essentially just as privileged guests. But fast forward a few hundred years to the 14th century, and this had evolved into a massive, highly integrated Adriatic economic system. By the time we hit the 16th century, a really bizarre geopolitical reality had set in. Spain was strictly controlling the Italian mainland, while Venice held absolute, undisputed dominance over the sea. Puglia wasn't a conquered land at all. It was effectively a frontier. Now, what's really interesting here is when you break down the exact nature of this power, the historical paradox just becomes crystal clear. Politically, there was zero Venetian occupation. Militarily, they really had no lasting formal control on the ground. But economically, their integration into the region's trade was absolute. And culturally, their sheer presence out on the water sparked massive migration waves that left permanent traces on the mainland. So, Venice was a complete political ghost, but an absolute economic powerhouse. Because of this wild dynamic, modern historians don't actually call Terra di Bari a conquered territory. They use a specific term, a contact zone. This is basically an area of high economic permeability and deep cultural exchange that exists entirely outside of direct political control. So, sandwiched right between the Neapolitan inland system on one side and the Venetian sea system on the other, this area became a vibrant, highly porous borderland. It was a place where money and ideas just moved freely, even if the formal political borders never actually changed. And one of the most profound ripple effects of living in a contact zone like this was human migration. It was driven by a really distinct chain reaction. Over in the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire was rapidly expanding, which created immense, terrifying pressure on local populations to flee their homes. Venice, who controlled the eastern shores of the sea, utilized its massive maritime networks to provide highly protected passage. So, refugees and workers just hopped on these short, safe sea routes, and they landed directly in Terra di Bari to start their lives over. Let's zoom in on a specific human story for a second. 500. That's the approximate number of Dalmatian migrants who crossed the Adriatic Sea in one specific recorded voyage. Now, I know 500 sounds tiny by today's globalization standards, but back in the early 17th century, dropping 500 people into a small, rural, agricultural community was more than enough to completely rewire the local cultural and economic DNA. We actually know exactly where a lot of these folks ended up. Right around 1615, these specific settlers founded a place called Casavaz, which today is known as Samenkale di Bari. This is the absolute clearest documented case of a migration structured entirely by Venetian maritime networks. And these 500 settlers didn't just quietly assimilate into the background, they integrated their Slavic origins, their oral traditions, and crucially, their own Balkan agricultural models directly into the Apulian soil. They literally changed how the land was farmed.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because this definitely wasn't an isolated incident. The Adriatic Sea wasn't a barrier, it was a bridge. And key port towns acted as these massive reception funnels for the migrants. Bari was the main entry point. We still have historical records showing a massive influx of Slavic sailors arriving there. Then you had Monopoli, which exploded into a bustling trade hub, literally adopting commercial terminology straight from Dalmatia. And Brindisi operated as a highly strategic outpost, locking in deep, long-term diplomatic cooperation with Venice.
Now, by the time we get to the 18th and 19th centuries, these distinct Slavic identities had largely blended in. But if you want to play historical detective today, the silent traces of this migration are still everywhere. You'll spot surnames with distinct Slavic endings right in the local phone books. You'll hear lexical borrowings and weird phonetic shifts in the Apulian dialects. You can literally walk through local vineyards today and see mixed farming layouts that were imported straight from the Balkans centuries ago. It's hiding in plain sight. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive economic engine driving this whole shebang: Venetian demand. Remember, Venice was a city built on a lagoon. They couldn't grow their own food, so they demanded colossal, staggering quantities of strategic resources like grain, olive oil, and wine from Puglia. Because of this literally insatiable appetite, local Apulian agriculture was fundamentally transformed. Farmers totally shifted their practices, expanding to meet these massive, long-distance export cycles that were dictated entirely by what Venice wanted to buy.
So the crucial point is this: if Venice was dominating the economy so heavily, why didn't the locals ever rise up and rebel against them? Well, because Venice was never their oppressor. The true painful subjugation of the local people came from their own local nobles and the incredibly harsh internal feudal system of the Kingdom of Naples. True emancipation for these people didn't finally arrive until the Napoleonic reforms way later in 1806, which abolished those local feudal privileges. Their oppressors were internal. They were never the external Venetians out on the water.
Which brings us to this absolutely beautiful historical paradox. Venice influenced Puglia not by ruling it, but by orbiting it. It's such a perfect metaphor. Much like the moon controls the tides of the ocean without ever actually touching the water, Venice shifted the economic tides of southern Italy. They funneled in migrants and literally shaped the landscape entirely from a distance. The people living there were politically southern, sure, but economically? Their lives were entirely tied to the Adriatic world that Venice had created.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought to chew on. History rarely stays in the past, right? It just changes form. If Venice could completely restructure the economy, the agriculture, and the demographics of an entire region without ever firing a shot or claiming the land, we have to ask ourselves, what invisible empires are orbiting our own economies today? What external forces, massive global corporations, or digital networks are quietly shaping our local landscapes right now completely off the map? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer today. I'll catch you next time.